I believe this to be basically for every person on this planet, but most people will never hear this and will never understand this because their subconscious is not willing to move their awareness beyond disidentification. But you are willing because you're here. Where do thoughts slip to when left unintended, when left unsupervised? They slip back to the default. They slip back to the default of your system. Why is that relevant? Because we are always manifesting, and when we are not consciously manifesting, we are manifesting from the default state. If you have experienced trauma in your life, then you have old charges of survival energy stuck in your system, most likely. The default is gonna represent and resemble that survival energy. The system always returns to the baseline. Hi everyone, today I want to talk about shifting your mental emotional state deliberately. So I found myself in a happy state during breakfast, and while I was eating, not focusing my thoughts on anything specific consciously, I noticed my thoughts slipping into worry and fear. I caught myself because I noticed it was affecting my mental emotional state immediately. So I thought, interesting. No judgment, no criticism, no beating myself up about it. Simply interesting. What is this here for? There is some sort of intention behind it, even if it's unconscious. My system tried to regulate itself back into my default state, which felt less than the state I was in having breakfast. I was happy, I was aligned, I was positive. My thoughts were not focused consciously, and so they slip back. Where do thoughts slip to when left unintended, when left unsupervised? They slip back to the default. They slip back to the default of your system. If the system has experienced huge charges of survival energy, then the default is gonna represent and resemble that survival energy. So for me personally, that meant my system got me back into the default state. My default state does not feel pleasant. That is not an exception. That is not me whining about my state. That is me having become aware of my default state, surrounded by many, many people, an entire society with low default states, unaware of those states. There is nothing bad about a low frequency default state. There is nothing bad about old charges of survival energy. You only gotta notice so that you can grow beyond it, choose beyond it, create an experience and a perception of your reality beyond it. That's your part. That's what you can do. That's everything you gotta do. I noticed, I caught myself, I got myself back into the happy state I had been in before. Okay, you just gotta notice and always assume everything you leave unattended, everything that's not supervised within your system is gonna return to the default state. What does that even mean? Why is that relevant? Because we are always manifesting, and when we are not consciously manifesting, we are manifesting from the default state. If you have experienced trauma in your life, then you have old charges of survival energy stuck in your system, most likely. And having done talk therapy for a year doesn't count, okay? Sorry to tell you, it does not count, okay? Energy is still there. You can work with it, you can change it, its form and shape, of course, obviously, but just with different ways, different modalities than talk therapy. This was just a thought because I noticed, as I always say, the first step is disidentification. So the first step is saying, oh no, this is not about me. And why do I get to say that? Because I live my life from disidentification for years. And I could give you the weirdest, funniest examples of my personal disidentification when other people told me, you gotta look at stuff. And I was like, oh no, thank you, there's nothing to look at, I'm fine. No, I was not fine. I'm fine now, okay? Because I've moved some of the charge. It's like I've made all the mistakes along the way so that you get to make less mistakes and be more time efficient about this one beautiful life you have been given, okay? That's what I'm talking about, disidentification and the default state here. To give you a chance to notice at a point in your life that is earlier than the point at which I noticed, after having lost years and decades of my life to a default state that was below neutral. But coming back to why I'm telling you this, the system always returns to the baseline, which is the default state. You know, I believe this to be basically for every person on this planet, but most people will never hear this and will never understand this because their subconscious is not willing to move their awareness beyond this identification. But you are willing because you're here. You're willing to do the work. You are possibly already doing the work. And whatever we are aware of, we can work with. And we are never done. As Abraham Hicks say, you're never going to get it done and you can't get it wrong. You cannot get it wrong. And of course, the two are related. We can't get it wrong because we are never going to be done. That's okay. Just keep on living. Just keep on expanding. Just keep on growing. But please do it with a greater level of awareness to move yourself beyond the default state. To move yourself into the awake state, which has always been your natural state. Beyond the conditioning. Beyond the belief in limitations. I'm so happy talking about this. I'm so happy having these experiences. You know, it can be really exhilarating. The moments where you notice, oh, my stage has slipped. What's happening? That is power. That is responsibility. There's nothing wrong about your default state. It has served you immensely. That's why it formed. And creating consciously, maybe having dreams and goals and a vision that you want to go after that are beyond the default, beyond your current version of reality. That's what requires you and also inspires and motivates us to grow beyond the default, to allow our system to raise the capacity for experiences beyond the protocol of interpretations that we have already gathered in our lives, because that's what the default state is based on. It's simply based on the protocols for the worst case scenarios we've ever experienced or ever have been afraid of experiencing. And all you gotta do is learn to move beyond that. And the first step for that is catching your state before you lose it. Staying awake before the beautiful feeling of bliss and ease and alignment ceases. And when it does, making it your first priority to get back in. Of course, we want to make it our first priority to get back in to the awake state, to the feeling of love and connection and abundance and presence in the now and embodiment and personal truth and individual self-expression, because that all is the same category. That's all the same. And one of our greatest struggles is that as soon as we regress into the default state, we are focused on the limitation, the blocks, and the things not working out and the lack mentality so much that we cannot hold the other perspective at the same time. Which makes sense because we cannot hold two opposing states at the same time. So you cannot reach the feeling or the prospect of love and abundance and connection from the lack and scarcity mentality. It's simply not possible. The gap in frequency is too wide. So once you're caught in a low frequency state, default state that is charged by survival energy, you're just stuck there. Because the awareness of what is actually happening right now, what am I experiencing, what am I feeling, how am I perceiving reality right now, these thoughts do not come automatically. They require practice. They require a higher baseline of awareness. The more you're practicing, the more you're doing this work, you are raising the baseline of your awareness. So that when you slip back into the default state, you are still more closely connected to the awareness that is gonna get you back out of that state by noticing, wait, what is happening here? I am doing this. This is my creation. This has a purpose. There's a reason for why I'm stuck in this state right now. Just that thought can propel you back to a neutral state, and from there, you can grow and expand into an awake state. And that's why anytime you notice being in a mental emotional state that is not serving you, that simply does not feel good, is so valuable. Is the first step, is the most important step, is the hardest step. Just that one hurdle. Everything is easier after you've taken that step. The more often you pull yourself out, consciously out of the default state, the more you are building the capacity to hold states of higher frequency. To hold the awake state for longer, which has been my experience. After I experienced my first awakening, over a decade ago, my first non-dual awakening, I didn't expect that to happen ever again because it felt like a miracle. It felt like a fairy tale. It was beyond anything I had ever experienced. And I talked about this in my last video. Actually, I just changed what I'm wearing. So this is the second video in a row I'm filming today. And in the video before this, you possibly watched this last week, I talked about how I was awake just a few moments ago. How I was awake this morning, which is a funny second video to film after that. So the first video I talked about how I was awake in the morning. And in this video, I talked about how I noticed myself slipping into a low frequency default state in the morning. Different day with the same potential. Two different outcomes. Because days, reality, perceived through two different states. That's the main difference. Always. The mental emotional state. So happy with how this turns out right now. Okay, but I love filming without the script. I love to experience myself in this spontaneous way of just talking because this didn't come naturally to me, okay? How I'm expressing right now is not part of my default state. You've witnessed the representation of my default state on camera the first 3 years of me filming content. Different energy, different mental emotional state, different perception of reality. But still interesting to say, I could experience the high level awakenings even before I was aware of any of this. Because I'm not talking about having a magic recipe that I want to share with you. Okay, you cannot buy my recipe. The universe distributes the same recipe to anyone who wants to listen. Because our perception is in our hands. And because our perception is in our hands, our reality is in our hands. State forms story. State forms 3D perception. Perception in brackets, because this also means that state forms the 3D period. I hope this was not too chaotic, and I really hope this resonated with you. Please let me know in the comments what you take away from this, where you're at in this journey of noticing your own default state and then growing beyond that to go after your dreams and your vision and your desires. Because you know that it's your responsibility and, more importantly, your creational power to do so. Have a beautiful week. I see you next time. Bye.